Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. So that brings us to the final panel discussion of the day. At the earlier panel on diversity and inclusion of women, Dr. Sulochana Sigera made a comment and she thanked the organizers for not keeping the women's panel for the end. So now you know why this panel is at the end. The things we men do for the women in our lives, I tell you. All right. Shanak actually stole my line because this theme for this panel discussion is actually titled The Ripple Effect. But I think as a good way of illustrating, he shared one example. Another one, an anecdote I'm sure you have often heard, which says that when one country sneezes or one region sneezes, another gets a cold, and a third region, probably half the world away, goes down with pneumonia. And that is really, that I think speaks to the interconnectedness and the interdependence of the global village that we operate in. So when I look at the previous panel discussion, I actually see some similarities with what this panel is actually going to be looking at. One of the reasons is it was talking about the volatile environment. And I think that's something that we will have in common because we will also be looking at the volatile environment. And I think it was Ashani who made the comment earlier that volatility is here to stay. And that certainly is the case. The only difference that I see is that the previous panel discussion was focused mainly on SMEs. And the difference is here we probably have some large corporates and conglomerates. So how these companies respond would be probably slightly different. Getting on to the topic itself, I read an article recently which describes Sri Lanka's situation as a fragile stability, which I believe is an appropriate description, since while we can certainly be pleased at the progress that's been made versus the dark days of the economic crisis, we are certainly not immune to external shocks, and one or more socio-economic disruptions could well set back the gains that have been made. We operate in a global environment where geopolitical tensions, policy uncertainty, and trade frictions have made volatility the only constant. Be it forex, interest rates, inflation, commodity prices, wars, civil unrest, disruption to shipping lanes, or changes to consumption patterns and buying behavior. We as a country can be impacted by global developments in any of these areas, or probably a combination thereof, not to mention black swan events. So much so that I had a leading industrialist in Sri Lanka remarking to me recently that long-term planning is now out of the window, and that the realistic planning horizon is now reduced to months instead of years for most corporates. Merchandise exports remain Sri Lanka's largest source of foreign exchange. And we have in our panel two gentlemen representing apparel, tea, and palm oil, which pretty much cover the main categories of our merchandise exports. So we will be examining how these corporates identify, forecast, and respond to global developments, be they opportunities or threats, since how these industries navigate these developments will certainly influence the country's development path. We also have with us a gentleman who represents the World Bank Group, which, as you know, is an international development organization with the stated aim of reducing poverty and boosting shared prosperity, who probably has a unique perspective on global development since that organization operates across nearly 200 countries. So Victor, I'm going to kick this off with you. A World Bank report on the global economy that came out in January 2026 stated that the 2020s are on track to be the weakest decade for global growth since the 1960s, with the sluggish pace set to widen the gap in living standards across the world. Can I kindly ask you to bring this nearer to us in terms of its likely impact upon Sri Lanka?
First of all, thank you very much for inviting me for this panel, and also very good afternoon to all of you. I should say that I've not been part of the rest of the day's proceedings, but I was there for the previous panel. And I should say I already feel that this is a well-organized event because I have a rocking chair here because it shows what the global trend is like. You are on a rocking chair all the time, so thank you for reminding that. So the question that Bertram spoke to me, just posed to me, is a very valid question. So that is stating of the fact, right? So let's say the 2020s will be a slow growth era for many countries, which is the fact. So you have to see from the fact then what you really derive from the fact, right? Let's say a sportsman is diagnosed with diabetes. Does she stop playing, right? So there are many measures that you could bring forth to make that person fit and then keep playing, right? So that's how I see that. That there are people who does diagnostics, and World Bank does that. And also then you see, okay, how do you manage this situation? So I would never get kind of worried about diagnosis. That's what helps us to understand what reality is. Then we start preparing ourselves to see how we kind of move forward. So that's the fact. That statement also compares 1960 to 2020s. It's a long time, 60 years. In 1960, the global economy was $540 billion. Today, it's $120 trillion, 200 times more, right? So you can always see that even in a $200 trillion economy, if there's a 2% growth, is much bigger than the growth that you would have seen in the 1960s. The population in 1960 was 3 billion. Today, it's 8.2 billion. So population has not grown the way that the GDP had grown. So there is still opportunity. So I see that there's plenty of opportunity in the world for us to make sure that everyone rides the game of growth in a way that's equitable for all. Are we ready? How do you really see that internalized for Sri Lanka? That's the biggest question, right? There's a lot being said and discussed about where Sri Lankan economy is. I mean, true, we probably aren't out of the woods yet. Certainly we are not, right? There's so much to do. People talk about debt sustainability and all of those things. But it's not a doom and gloom game for us, right? So what do we do from here to build on to make sure that we ride that growth is what we need to think of as governments and private sector and other interested stakeholders. This is where I think there needs to be a cohesive strategy to see how we can take that next level of growth to make it more pertinent to the environment that we are living in. That, internalizing that and making sure that we understand the environment that we are living in is what we need to do. So let's take, for example, the ripple effects that you spoke about, Bertram. Let's say, take the commodity prices. Let's say the fuel prices increase tomorrow by 20% because of geopolitical tension or whatever reason that is. And what would do to a country that's fossil fuel dependent for energy, right? It will put the prices up. So there'll be inflation, there'll be depreciation, there'll be interest rate hikes, all of that will be there. Are we ready to face such an environment right now? Maybe not. But how do we build that, realizing that that could happen any moment is what we should be doing as governments, private sector, and partners in development. So that's one thing that we need to understand. So global shocks aren't under our control, but how we prepare to face the global shock is well within our control. That's what we need to realize. So I feel that sometimes we chase quantity versus quality. So if you take, for example, I would rather see that Sri Lanka not reach 5 million tourists, but have 5 times the revenue that we get from tourists with 20% of the arrivals, without really stressing the economy and the rest of the kind of resources that we have, right? So how do we remodel this? I'm just taking examples, right? So this is one thing that you could look at. And I heard people saying that we have a $1 billion software industry. How do we make that $2 billion? Is that what we really want? Let's say we have 200,000 people working in the software industry right now, right? So to do the same model, we need 400,000 people to do it. Do we have that? I mean, where are we going to get that? So do we change the model to say, okay, AI is everywhere? Shall we like remodel to see where we have to go, where we have to refocus our agenda? So there are different ways to dissect this model and see what we have to do. So I would not take much time, but I'm just leaving these as kind of provocative thoughts. And in the rest of the questions that you may have, I'll dwell deep into that.
Thank you, Victor. I'm going to move to Vish now. Vish, the Middle East and the Commonwealth of Independent States form the main markets for Ceylon tea exports. With both regions ranking high in terms of geopolitical tensions, what kind of impact would any disruption to these markets have on the tea industry? And how is the industry responding to the potential challenge?
Thank you. I too would like to thank AmCham Sri Lanka for inviting me to this panel. No pun intended, but I'm glad the World Bank chair is rocking and not my chair. For a change, I think that's better. To talk about tea, it's quite interesting that largest producer, one of the largest producer and exporter of tea, Sri Lanka is today serving some beautiful coffee outside, and you have chosen them as one of your sponsors. So you can see, how fast things are changing. I don't see any big Sri Lankan brand out there, and it used to be called Tea Breaks. I guess it's no longer Tea Breaks. So you can see the challenges, all right? Middle East, the former CIS altogether, pretty much used to, buy more than good 60% of Sri Lanka's total production. We used to produce something like 300 to 315 million kilos of tea. We have probably dropped down to about 270 million now. And more than volume, the Middle East used to consume most of our value tea. The best tea from Sri Lanka used to go to Iran and Iraq in the good old days. They were the best buyers. We used to have the state-owned tea buying officers of Iraq and Iran sitting at our tea auction and bidding for our teas. That was the time. So our exporters were just only there to ship the tea. Those officers used to sit at the tea auction and buy the creme de la creme of our teas. That has now, of course, changed. Sri Lanka still, by volume, is a bulk tea exporter as a commodity, not as a value-added exporter. We are still very much dependent on the Middle East and the Russian buying. We are trying hard to break into the American market, which is growing, but it's not in volume terms, it's not still very big. So when we spoke, and that's what I said, when there's a sneeze there, we catch a cold. It is so dependent, right? And there were times when, petroleum prices went up. There was more money in the Middle East. They paid better prices for our tea. It's been a long time since petroleum prices have gone up. So tea industry is, the last 20 years or so been going through some kind of struggle. But Sri Lanka has still managed to export whatever we produce each year, but not at the best times. So every time we see conflict in the Middle East, it's a very difficult time here. And also our productivity is probably the lowest in the region. If you compare our neighbors in India, their productivity and our productivity in our tea estates, it's not comparable at all. But we continue to say that, we make quality tea, etc., but that can only go so far. So yeah, in a nutshell, we are dependent on the Middle East and the former Russian states. We are a bulk tea exporter. We should move to more value added. We should go into markets that we have not been to. We are not present at all in South America. We are trying to go into North America. Japan used to be one of our best markets, but a few years back, we have had people who run this country who had made some decisions. We went through an era of not having weedicide. I hope everybody remembers that. We just thought we can go organic overnight. All that meant was people used, illegal weedicide, which meant the minimum residue levels in our teas went up. Japan rejected. Japan went to Indonesia. They suddenly found Indonesian tea is much cheaper, faster, easier to get. And you lose a market like Japan, good night. It'll take years to get it back.
Thank you, Vish. I think one of the points that came through from your response was that, yes, there are challenges, but there are also opportunities, and it's a question of pursuing those. I'm going to move to Suren now. Suren, the apparel industry has probably been the most affected by the reciprocal tariffs, and I know the last week saw even more turbulence in that area. With operations across multiple markets and sourcing from various different countries, can you tell us how the industry has responded to these challenges?
Sure, thanks, Bertram, for this question. You're right, when the tariffs were initially announced almost a year ago in April of last year, I think the whole world was in shock. There was panic, whether it was the brands or the retailers or manufacturers such as ourselves did not really know how to respond. And it's been a ride like that since last April, and the landscape keeps changing ever so often. And as you said, just as as late as last week, where the tariffs that were imposed for the reciprocal tariffs that were imposed under the Emergency Economic Act, the Supreme Court of the U.S. Took it off, saying that there's no legal basis. So what happens to the taxes that the brands and retailers have already paid? It's going to be refunded. And of course, the Trump administration also immediately announced another global tax of 10% and later revised it to 15%. So in one sense, it might be lower. But for example, if you look at Sri Lanka versus China, China was at 35 and Sri Lanka at 20. If China also comes down to 15, then probably things might not be that great for us and for the other countries. So there's still a lot of uncertainty. Things are being worked out, but I think if there's one thing that we've realized is, as you said, we used to call in our business, you have your strategic projects and things that you do for the future, and then you have your BAU, business as usual. Now you don't, you still have a BAU, but now it's business always unusual. So that's the kind of, we are almost in like sustained crisis. But as companies and I think as industries, as countries, we've got to come to terms with it and be able to have our answers to move on and continue to move forward. So I think as an industry, we came under a lot of pressure, and the brands were also unable to pass this increase of duty to their consumers, because probably since after COVID, those retailers and brands have also been under pressure for margins, and therefore there was pressure put on us, manufacturers, for discounts and so on. But of course, with time, still there are those sort of, reduced prices that some brands continue to ask for, but at the same time, there is some degree of stability now. Some of those increases have been passed on to the consumer, but prices have got adjusted and sort of recalibrated, and in terms of business, things are moving on. How have we responded as an industry and as a company? Probably in hindsight, not very different to what we would have done anyway, regardless of tariffs. And what do I mean by that? Things that we've been doing, for example, focusing on newness and innovation and really bringing in outstanding or delivering outstanding value to our customers, whether it's through product innovation, through newness in fashion, whether it's through product or service, in terms of really differentiating ourselves. Continuing to invest in technology becomes absolutely important, again, to stay ahead of the game, focusing on productivity, and really ensuring that we keep our costs under control. And these things are probably things that we would have done regardless of tariffs. So that journey still sort of we are staying on course and focused on that journey. Also having a diversified manufacturing footprint in conditions like this helps, not because necessarily you want to move business out of Sri Lanka, but for the customers it gives an increased level of comfort to know that if there is a crisis in a particular country or in a region, you are able to still supply and deliver a product, and that in turn helps you to gain a larger share of your business. And so therefore, as a country, you will still continue to benefit. So that becomes important. And then, of course, another critical piece, I think, for us in Sri Lanka is verticality. Really being able to not just cut and sew and manufacture and export product, but to be able to source the raw material locally, because that's a key way in which you can differentiate. You can bring in a lot of innovation through your material. You are able to manage risks a lot better. That's something that all of us learned through COVID and the Red Sea crisis and all the other challenges that the world has seen. And also you are able to offer speed and flexibility if you have your supply chain closer to you. So developing verticality becomes absolutely important, and it helps also to create more value in Sri Lanka rather than import materials and then sort of add that value in conversion and sending it off, if you can create that value in Sri Lanka. Developing new markets. I think Vish spoke about the Japanese market, and that's a big market and a very loyal customer if you are able to secure them, and they value quality, craftsmanship, compliance, and so on. And I think Sri Lanka is uniquely positioned to explore markets such as Japan. Then there's also East Asia, whether it's countries like Taiwan, Indonesia, Vietnam. They also have their own supply bases, and the economic model is different, but it's a growing market. The growing market and increasingly a growing middle class population. So if you're able to crack the code in terms of economics, these are new markets that will open up for you. So in short, Bertram, if there's something that I think all of us have learned, or a silver lining on this tariff seas, I think it has forced companies, not only in apparel, but probably in other industries as well, to really reshape our supply chains and to look at building really resilient business and operating models, and to look at new and creative and innovative ways in creating value to customers. So if there's something good that's come out of it, I would highlight those.
Thanks, Suren. I think you said something quite interesting where you said that the response to the tariffs was what you would have done even if the tariffs hadn't come about, right? So that's interesting in terms of being prepared, and you spoke about verticality and so on. And so it's great to see the industry really being prepared, or at least some companies. Victor, I'm going to come back to you and ask you, what do you see as the upside risks or the opportunities for Sri Lanka stemming from global economic developments?
Yeah, so I touched upon that in my first reactions as well, but I think what we feel that we need to do is to take the resources that we have to the global market in the right perspective. I'll take cinnamon, for example. Cinnamon competes with cassia, which is, I don't want to call it a fake product, but at least a product that is carcinogenic, which doesn't have the properties of cinnamon, right? But it commands a higher price than the cinnamon at the moment because of the way that it's marketed, right? And also, globally, it was possible to have 30% of a product and say that is the product that you send. So you can mix it with a product and then say, okay, this is Ceylon cinnamon. Ceylon cinnamon is only in Sri Lanka, right? So are we doing enough to promote the Ceylon cinnamon in the way it should be? Are we adding value in the way it should be? Take coconut, for example, right? So we always want to compete in the market which is saturated. Let's say Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, Everyone's exporting coconut water, coconut milk, virgin oil, all of that. But we also want to compete in the market with the same products, right? Is there anything else that we could do? I read an article on the British Medical Journal some time ago, which says that coconut oil pressed at a certain temperature can actually be regenerating neurons, which is good for all these Alzheimer's, dementia, and stuff. How much of research and development that goes into in terms of saying, can we be the first mover of that using our coconuts, often complaining about the nuts not being enough to kind of do what we want to do, right? So these are some of the questions that we need to ask ourselves when we want to kind of compete globally in a way that will make sense, that people will come to take Sri Lankan product. Ceylon tea was that some time ago. We lost that, you know? Why do we always keep losing the competitive advantage that we have, right? So our preparation towards meeting this world order, which is going to be always very difficult to kind of predict, right? Because geopolitical tensions are going to be there to stay. I'm sure that everyone can predict that will happen rather than saying that it will not happen, right? So jolly well knowing that, as in the previous panel the speaker said, that is a given, and that's the condition that we have to work with, right? So that is something that we need to recognize and say that I am ready to face that. So have we done enough of that? So take technology, for example. We have Lanka Harness, which is doing very well on the airbag sensor, right? So if you take the Middle Eastern economies, where you take Lebanon, for example, which is in like really a difficult time because it will probably never come out of the economic issues that it is in, because there's an $80 billion hole for the banking sector, right? But there are industries that are thriving. Take the semiconductor industry that is based out of Lebanon, where you see that they are kind of providing these artificial interconnects, which actually helps kind of most of the European and the US markets, right? And when I actually visited one of those production facility, I was so surprised to see that there are people kind of seated in a kind of row, and then everyone's just putting red on green, blue on black, Y on D. And then in the end, you have a vacuum packed thing, which is going to cost so much more than what it was at the beginning. And none of those products are sourced from Lebanon. Everything comes from outside, right? And 10,000 of those going out on an airplane to another country and bringing in so much of revenue. We are planning industrial zones, BOI zones. Why can't we think of that? There are enough and more Sri Lankans who are in the design capabilities of working in US. They can come back and then start this. What does it need? The infrastructure that we need has to be facilitated. We are always a public finance dependent economy, always. If you take, public infrastructure-led growth has been the highest that post-war that actually brought us. Everyone says that was a golden era, but in my opinion, we should have probably leveraged that public investment to do 40% growth than like be happy with the 8%, 9% that we were achieving. That was on a very small economy, okay? So the thing is that government financing is so limited right now. And how do we really leverage that government finance to make sure that it enables private sector financing? You need to create jobs for economy to grow. Jobs don't just get created. They're not like mushrooms. You have to invest to grow. And does Sri Lanka have that investment capacity? Yes, there are a lot of corporates who are investing, but also you need to get FDIs. I hear there are lots of kind of debates and discussions that go on like what is needed. We need to have efficiency-seeking investments coming in, not the ones that are going to come in for tax incentives. I think we have to make that bold statement. You come to Sri Lanka because we have a competitive advantage. Our competitive advantage is not suffocating our revenue sources, government revenue sources. So we need to mix these policies in a more meaningful way to ensure that we use both sides of the coin, the government and the private sector, to ensure that we have a very dominant FDI-based economy as well. And not only that, we also have to ensure our corporates go overseas, because we have had like very successful corporates in Sri Lanka for a long time. How many of them are global companies? Why are they not global companies? So many other companies which came after them in other countries are global giants, right? So we are very happy, this island mentality, I have enough, this is what it is, or very cozy in terms of how we do it. So we have to challenge ourselves to go to that next level. So it's a mix of everything put together. So the role of the government has to be recognized to bring in the investments that you need, and the private sector has to kind of come in to make sure that they leverage on whatever that's there. Public-private partnership. I mean, I heard the minister saying land is a non-negotiable reform instrument. All right, then how do you actually make land available? Can we have a very nice scheme which says, here's the land bank that you have for investment. These are government lands. We understand 82% of the land base in Sri Lanka is government-owned. And out of the rest of it, also it's temple and religious institutions owned. So we are competing for private sector land, which is very small. So that is going to drive the prices up, which is going to make investments not feasible. So can we make sure that the government has a land bank? They create the public-private partnership environment to make sure that they share the land, others bring the investment, 99-year leases, 33-year leases, and make sure that this comes in. So that reform is needed. We're not saying alienating land is the reform. Making the land available is the reform. So these are very strategic questions we need to ask the governments to kind of make sure that we enable the environments.
Thank you, Victor. I would like to remind the audience about the QR codes that's on your table. If you want to ask questions, you can send it in. Also, I plea for help here from the Emojet team. I need you guys to reset the tab because I'm not seeing the questions, whoever's handling it. Okay, guys. Right, so let me move to Vish for my next question. Vish, the conglomerate that you represent is into healthcare and also I know agriculture as well, right? So the question I have is in the area of what global developments do you typically monitor in the conglomerate you head when planning for your businesses?
Thank you, Bertram. I think as a conglomerate, one monitors obviously what's going on in terms of political stability, because especially when it comes to healthcare, most of our healthcare into Sri Lanka, pharmaceuticals, devices, etc., is imported. And I think we learned a big lesson during COVID in terms of supply chain issues where we had huge issues getting medication back into the country. So that is something that we monitor to make sure where the imports are coming from, where the factories are located, and whether due to any of the political instability or any other outbreak of disease, etc., whether any of these things can disrupt the import coming in. But then issues like shipping lanes, I mean, that is something that comes from left field for us. Sometimes ships that came within 4 or 5 weeks suddenly started taking 2 months to come. So planning for that kind of stocking and supply chain is horrendous, and especially when it comes to pharmaceuticals, expiry dates are very short. Especially some very important medication does not come with long shelf life. It comes with very, very short shelf life. Antibiotic injections come with less than sometimes 4 to 6 week shelf life. So trying to import that and keeping it in stock, and most of the time when you're the distributor, people think that you should be having unlimited stock when it's called for. So when suddenly when it's your child or your mother or father that's in hospital and you find out so and so is the distributor and this idiot doesn't have the stock, try explaining to that person what's going on the rest of the world. So these are all things, especially in the healthcare, it's a huge challenge to monitor. And now in the last, I would say 2-3 years, it has become even bigger challenge with the tariffs, with the war spending everywhere, and the difficulties, economic difficulties that we had, exchange control issues, financial issues. So I can name a huge amount, so that there is a modeling that goes on to make sure that we have the right products, right time, and then also physicians continue to change as new predictions come, what type of medication they use. So all these are things that we monitor. On the agriculture side, we run a dairy farm, and one of the big challenge in the dairy is to get the right feed. Feed is always a continuous issue. Sri Lanka does not, unfortunately, produce the kind of feed these animals need. The dairy, the cows that we have on a daily basis, consumes something like, give or take 40 to 50 kilos of food per animal per day. And when you have over 2,500 herd, you have to kind of stock this feed. And to get this feed on time, again, world market feed is a commodity. So you need to continuously monitor where is the cheapest feed available, and then we also have to make sure this quality of this feed is checked before it's brought in. So these are the things that we continuously monitor. I hope I have.
Yeah, certainly. Thanks, Vish. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move on. Suren, can I ask you, in your industry, consumer demand is a key determinant of your product offering. How do you keep abreast with changes in consumer taste and demand patterns at a global level?
Thanks, Bertel. Yeah, I think today in the age of digital technology and AI, demand keeps demand patterns and trends keep changing and fluctuating quite rapidly. And in this day and age, of course, the advantage is predicting demand is no longer just pure guesswork or even intuition-led, but it's more driven by data analytics and various tools that you can use to predict that demand. However, that's on the plus side. On the negative side is, demand signals keep changing ever so often, and consumers also are sometimes quite fickle in terms of the choices they make. And we see this happening before even we speak about ourselves as a garment vendor or a manufacturer. We see this happening in the marketplace as well. Some of the younger and the newer brands that have come into the marketplace, especially in North America and Europe, we see that they have a much more smaller but a more loyal consumer base. They are more regionalized or localized, but the consumers prefer to buy that kind of product because it sort of is in sync with their handwriting, their lifestyle, and they have a lot of affinity for that community or those, the smaller brands. And they're actually slowly but surely taking sometimes market share away from the larger players. So we see those changes taking place, in the global market. And the challenge for us is to make sure how do we pick those right, or rather, if I may put it more simply, bet on those right horses, who might be your next, Gymshark or Lululemon. How do you pick those brands? Because they're still small, but they're showing a lot of potential. And if you back the right customers, your business will automatically grow. So I think, again, technology plays a big role in helping us to understand and assimilate this data and make those choices. And of course, social media. Social media plays such a big role, especially in the younger consumers' minds of, choosing or picking brands, and of course, led by influencers. Just to share a small anecdote, we work with this brand called Skims. It's a North American brand, started in North America as online sales, but now it's an international brand, and they're opening their stores as well. And this brand is co-founded, some of you may know, with Kim Kardashian, a famous media personality. So in terms of data, Skims as a brand has about 7.5 or 7.2 million followers on their Instagram page. Kim Kardashian has 350 million followers, and she's the co-owner of this brand. So you can just imagine, she takes a Skims product and puts it on her self and takes a picture and posts on Instagrams. You can see the Skims sales, just picking up. You don't need to do much marketing, to drive the sales. So, but these are the kind of consumer whom you're dealing with, and sometimes their choices are also fickle. It's a hit today, might not necessarily be there for the next 5 years. But it's again important to use data and technology to be able to really do do that kind of analytics and be able to pick those trends and then really ride that momentum. And to do that, we can't do it alone. We have to work very closely with our brands. We have to be seamlessly connected in the value chain so that there is no time lost in that information and that data and that insight flow, where we are all able to then respond and react quickly and chase business. Even when we look at our business, maybe 5, 10 years ago, 90% was seasonal, and maybe another 10% to chase, based on what's doing well. Today it's probably 30 to 40% chase because the brand's also not sure. You would launch something, and if you launch 5, if you have 5 launches, maybe 2 would work, but the 2 that work, you have to really chase after that and make those businesses bigger. So you have to have that the agility and the flexibility to be able to respond to those market demand fluctuations. What's also taking place, and it's connected to this, is again the use of technology from our side of our business in product creation. A few years ago, all products were made physically. The sample would go to a customer, they would wear it, the comments would come, and then you send another sample. This whole process might take 2 or 3 months or sometimes even longer. Today, at least, those initial concepts are being replaced by digital technology. You have digital prototyping. You can use avatars to fit on the garment to see how it performs, how it looks on the body, how it functions, and so on. And that has really helped us to reduce our lead times. Use of technology to really, compress those lead times. If you look at the product itself, it's going through various sort of transitions and transformations. Today we have almost 20 to 30% of our products, having some sort of different technology to cut and sew, what we are used to. There are bonding technologies, fusing technologies, which gives a more cleaner finish. It fits better, it functions or performs better on body, and so on. And you must be able to have the capacity to be able to invest and modernize your manufacturing. And that's why it's important, even for the government, to provide some form of encouragement. Maybe incentives not in the form of tax, but to really encourage people to invest in research and innovation, to make sure that we stay ahead of that game, and as a country, that we play in that value to value premium segments. We can't compete with an Indonesia or a Bangladesh or a Vietnam purely on scale. I mean, we are just too small, and we don't need to compete. These countries have, apparel exports of $45, $50 billion. We have been in this $5 billion for the last probably 10 to 15 years. It goes to 4.8, it goes to 5.2, but basically flatlined. How can we take that to maybe from a 5 billion to an 8 billion? And that extra 3 billion must come from value-added product, not necessarily scale and volume and mass market. And that's why it's important to make those right investments and continue to invest in those areas where we can really differentiate ourselves and create a unique place for ourselves in the marketplace. Consumers increasingly are also very, very keen about sustainability. They want to know not just how the product is made, but why it's being made, where it's being made, and so on. And I think again, especially we see that in Europe, where most products that flow into Europe now, the brands are almost insisting to know that the product must last longer, must have some element of recycled, it must be recyclable, and then disposed in a responsible manner. And increasingly, these governments are passing that responsibility to the brands. So therefore, from the brands, it will flow into us as well. And I think as a country, we are again uniquely positioned to take advantage of these trends and consumer preferences, because we are always seen as a socially and ethically responsible manufacturer. So there are some levers that we can really pull to differentiate ourselves and grow the industry, not necessarily in quantum in terms of value, but in terms of quality of value of sales we bring in.
Thank you, Suren. So we are really short on time, and I've got a whole lot of questions. A lot of them actually directed to you, interestingly. We don't have time to go in, but what is interesting is the top voted question for you was on Sri Lanka's comparative advantage, and you actually answered that. So thanks for that. I'd just like to touch on one thing and probably pose it to all three of you, if possible. There is a recurring theme, and that is about the brain drain in Sri Lanka. So the question is, very briefly, if you could share, Vish, if I can start with you, how is it affecting your organization, and how you dealing with it?
Yeah, I mean, obviously during the economic crisis, all of us felt it. There was an exodus of our, teams just leaving the country, and it was impossible. But then you have to have, planned succession planning within the company, and I think it's very key for most companies to have bench strength continuously to make sure those gaps are filled. There's nothing you can do about people leaving. I mean, we can only, the country from the government side, they can make it more attracting for our youngsters to come back. But as companies, we have to have our bench strength ready.
Thanks. Suren?
Yeah, I think that would be our key leave as well. We experienced a similar sort of situation, maybe 2022, 2023, when we had all these challenges. But we see a reduction now, and I think especially with regards to the younger population or the younger executives who join the company, their preferences and their needs and their wants are also fundamentally different. I think first is to understand what that difference is. They value their personal time. They value purpose in the work that we do. They want to work in a environment which is conducive for them and offers them growth and maybe multiple opportunities. So I think first is to identify what that gap is, and then to plan your strategies accordingly to make sure that you're able to retain them. I think it might be almost naive to think that they're going to be with you for the next 10 years. But if you're able to bring them on board and give them the required training and development and then keep them for maybe 5-6 years, and of course some of them will continue to grow, I think even if you have a healthy level of attrition, you should be able to manage. But I think first is to understand that there's a significant gap. That's what we are saying. And to be able to address that gap in a meaningful way.
Victor, anything to add on the same lines?
I agree with all of them, but also I say that exodus is not a bad thing, because you need Sri Lankans to go out, bring that back. So how you bring that reverse is what we actually have to work on, and it has to be a cycle. Let's say you go at 22, come back at 35, and then you contribute back to what you need to do. Do we have what it takes to do it right now? No, but how do we do it is what we should concentrate on.
Thank you, Victor. So that really brings us to the end of this session. I see that I'm 2 minutes over time. Apologies for that to the organizers. But it's been very interesting. Thank you to all three gentlemen for your contributions. It was quite insightful. With that, I'm not going to recap what they said because I think it was quite clear. But clearly, few things that came out is that while there are challenges, there are also opportunities, and being prepared, being proactive, as Suren shared, would actually be the way out from this volatility that we see. So with that, I'd like to hand back to Shanaka. Thank you.